The piercing scream caught everyone's attention as Willow Warren went tumbling from the boardwalk, her blue calico dress billowing around her before she landed with a sickening splash in the thick brown mud below. San Pedro, California, 1876, a bustling port town where the respectable rarely found themselves face down in filth, especially not ladies of quality. "That'll teach you to refuse a dance, Miss High and Mighty," sneered Clancy Dobbs, the son of San Pedro's wealthiest shipping merchant. His laughter echoed across the busy street as onlookers gasped, but kept their distance. No one dared cross a Dobbs in this town. Willow struggled to rise, mortification burning hotter than the California sun as mud caked her carefully pinned hair and ruined the dress she'd spent 3 months' savings on. Her fingers sank into the muck as she tried to gain purchase, dignity slipping away with each failed attempt. "Need a hand, madam?" The deep voice came from above her, and Willow looked up through mud-streaked lashes to see a tall figure silhouetted against the afternoon sun. Without waiting for her response, the stranger jumped down from the boardwalk, seemingly unconcerned about his fine leather boots sinking ankle-deep in mud. Strong hands grasped her elbows, lifting Willow to her feet with surprising gentleness. "Easy now," he murmured, his voice low enough for only her to hear. "Thank you," she whispered, mortified tears threatening to spill. She finally got a clear look at her rescuer, a man she'd never seen before. Tall and broad-shouldered with a dark hat shading piercing blue eyes. His clothes were trail-worn but of good quality, marking him as a man who'd seen his share of dust but wasn't destitute. A cowboy by the look of him, with calloused hands that spoke of hard work. "You all right, miss?" he asked, concern evident in his expression. Before Willow could respond, Clancy's mocking voice cut through the murmurs of the gathering crowd. "Don't waste your time with that one, stranger. School teachers ought to know their place in this town." The cowboy's expression hardened, but his voice remained steady as he helped Willow find her footing. "Stay here," he said quietly before turning to face Dobbs. "Where I come from," the cowboy said, his voice carrying easily across the suddenly quiet street, "men don't push ladies." "Any particular reason you felt the need to do so today?" Clancy's face reddened. "Mind your business, cowpoke. You're not from around here." "Matthew Atwood," the cowboy said, stepping forward and closing the distance between them with purposeful strides, "and I'm making it my business." Clancy's hand twitched toward his waistcoat, but Matthew was already there, his movement so fast that Willow barely saw it happen. One moment he was beside her, the next he had Clancy's wrist in a vice grip. "I wouldn't," Matthew said calmly. "Now, I believe you owe the lady an apology." "Do you know who my father is?" Clancy sputtered, his face turning from red to purple. "Don't much care," Matthew replied. "I know who you are now, a man who pushes women into the mud. That tells me everything I need to know." The standoff lasted several heartbeats. Willow held her breath, aware that the entire street had gone silent. Even the saloon piano had stopped. Finally, Clancy yanked his hand free. "This isn't over," he hissed before stalking away, shooting venomous glances at the spectators who quickly resumed their business, pretending they hadn't witnessed his humiliation. Matthew turned back to Willow, his stern expression softening. "Let me help you somewhere you can get cleaned up, miss." "Warren. Willow Warren," she managed, suddenly aware of how she must look, her carefully pinned hair now a mud-caked disaster, her new dress ruined. "I'm the school teacher." "Miss Warren," he nodded respectfully. "I'd be obliged if you'd allow me to escort you home." "That's very kind, Mr. Atwood, but she hesitated, looking down at her mud-soaked clothing. "I can't possibly walk through town like this." Matthew seemed to consider this problem. Then, without warning, he shrugged off his long duster coat and held it out to her. "If you wouldn't mind," he said. The coat swallowed her, but it covered the worst of the mud. As they walked, Willow became acutely aware of the whispers following them. San Pedro was a small town with a big appetite for gossip, and she knew by morning everyone would be talking about the schoolteacher, the cowboy, and Clancy Dobbs's public humiliation. "You're new to San Pedro," she said. Not a question, but a statement. "Just rode in this morning," Matthew confirmed, keeping a respectful distance as they walked. "Got some business with the cattle buyers down at the harbor." "You've made an enemy before sundown," Willow said quietly. "The Dobbs family owns half this town." Matthew's smile was slight but genuine. "Wouldn't be the first time I've started trouble before unpacking my saddlebags." Despite her discomfort and embarrassment, Willow found herself returning his smile. "Well, Mr. Atwood, I'm grateful, even if your timing in town is unfortunate." "I'd say my timing was just right, Miss Warren." They reached the small but neat clapboard house near the schoolhouse where Willow had lived since arriving in San Pedro the previous year. She stopped at the gate. "Thank you again. I can manage from here." Matthew tipped his hat. "Glad to help, madam." He hesitated, then added, "If you don't mind my asking, why did Dobbs push you?" Willow sighed, her hand clutching the borrowed coat closer. "I refused his offer to escort me to the Founders' Day dance next Saturday." "It's not the first time, but it was certainly the most dramatic rejection he's received." "Man doesn't take no for an answer. Men like Clancy Dobbs aren't accustomed to hearing it," Willow replied, a hint of bitterness in her voice. Matthew nodded thoughtfully. "Well, Miss Warren, I expect I'll see you around town while I'm here." He tipped his hat again and turned to leave. "Mr. Atwood," Willow called after him, "your coat." He glanced back with a smile. "Keep it for now. I'll collect it another time." As she watched him walk away, Willow felt a strange flutter in her chest. It had been a long time since anyone had stood up for her. As a woman alone in a frontier town, she'd learned to fend for herself, to be independent and cautious. But there had been something reassuring about Matthew Atwood's quiet confidence. Inside her modest home, Willow peeled off the mud-soaked clothing, filling her wash basin with water to begin the arduous task of cleaning herself. As she worked, she couldn't help but wonder about the cowboy who'd come to her rescue. San Pedro saw its fair share of drifters and cowboys, but few stayed long, and fewer still would risk crossing the Dobbs family for a stranger. She hung his coat carefully after brushing off what mud she could. It smelled of leather, horses, and something indefinably masculine like open prairie and wood smoke. For some reason, the scent made her feel safe. Little did Willow know that this chance encounter would change the course of her carefully ordered life in ways she could never have imagined. The next morning, Willow awoke early as was her habit. Despite her best efforts, her hair still carried traces of mud, requiring another washing before she could present herself to her students. The schoolhouse was a short walk from her home, and she usually enjoyed the morning stroll, greeting neighbors and shopkeepers as the town came to life. Today, however, she felt the weight of eyes on her, heard the hushed conversations that stopped as she approached. News traveled fast in San Pedro. "Morning, Miss Warren," called Mrs. Peterson from the general store doorway. The older woman's eyes sparkled with barely contained curiosity. "Heard you had quite the adventure yesterday." "Good morning, Mrs. Peterson," Willow replied evenly. "Nothing too adventurous, I assure you." "And that cowboy who helped you quite the handsome fellow, isn't he?" Mrs. Peterson continued, undeterred. "Stopped by the store this morning for supplies, polite as can be." "I'm grateful for his assistance," Willow said noncommittally, though her heart quickened at the mention of Matthew. "Well, you be careful, dear," Mrs. Peterson cautioned. Clancy Dobbs was in here earlier looking like thunder, his father's none too pleased either. Willow's stomach tightened. Gerald Dobbs was not a man to cross. As the owner of the largest shipping company in San Pedro, he wielded considerable influence, including over the school board that employed her. "Thank you for the warning," she said. "I should get to the schoolhouse. The children will be arriving soon." The school day passed without incident, though Willow found her thoughts drifting to Matthew Atwood more often than was proper. She had just dismissed her students for the day and was organizing her desk when a shadow fell across the doorway. Expecting it to be a parent, she looked up with a welcoming smile that faltered when she saw Gerald Dobbs himself standing there, his substantial frame filling the doorway. In his 60s, with steel-gray hair and cold eyes, Dobbs Sr. had the hard look of a man who'd built his fortune through tenacity and ruthlessness in equal measure. "Mr. Dobbs," she greeted him, straightening her spine, "this is an unexpected visit." "Miss Warren," he replied, his voice deceptively pleasant. "I understand there was an unfortunate incident involving my son yesterday." Willow chose her words carefully. "There was a misunderstanding, yes. A misunderstanding that resulted in my son being publicly humiliated by some drifter," Dobbs said, stepping into the classroom. "And you were at the center of it." "Your son pushed me off the boardwalk, Mr. Dobbs," Willow said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "The drifter, as you call him, merely helped me up and suggested Clancy apologize." Dobbs's eyebrows rose. "Is that how you remember it?" "Because from what I hear, you've been encouraging my son's attentions only to rebuff him publicly." "That is absolutely untrue," Willow said, anger flaring. "I have politely declined his invitations multiple times." "A woman in your position should be grateful for such attention," Dobbs said, his tone hardening. "School teachers come and go in San Pedro, Miss Warren. Your contract renewal comes before the board next month, as I'm sure you're aware." The threat was unmistakable. Willow felt her cheeks flush, but held her ground. "Are you suggesting my employment depends on accepting your son's advances, Mr. Dobbs?" "I'm suggesting that those who make enemies in this town rarely prosper," he replied coldly. "And that includes wandering cowboys who don't know their place." Before Willow could respond, a new voice entered the conversation. "Afternoon, folks. Hope I'm not interrupting." Matthew Atwood stood in the doorway, hat in hand, his expression pleasant but his eyes alert and assessing. He was freshly shaved, his dark hair still damp, and he'd clearly obtained clean clothes since yesterday. "Mr. Atwood," Willow said, relief washing over her. "Miss Warren." He nodded politely before turning to Dobbs. "And you must be Mr. Dobbs. Your reputation precedes you, sir." Dobbs regarded Matthew with undisguised contempt. "As does yours, apparently. I understand you manhandled my son yesterday." "I simply encouraged him to apologize for pushing Miss Warren here into the mud," Matthew replied easily. "Where I come from, that's called manners, not manhandling." "Where you come from is of no interest to me," Dobbs snapped. "What matters is that you're interfering in affairs that don't concern you." "When a lady is pushed into the mud, it concerns any decent man in the vicinity," Matthew countered, his voice still pleasant but with an underlying firmness that made Willow's pulse quicken. Dobbs's face darkened. "You do well to remember that San Pedro isn't friendly to troublemakers, Cowboy. I suggest you conclude whatever business brought you here and move on." "Appreciate the advice," Matthew said with a slight smile, "but I find I'm liking the view in San Pedro. Might stay a while." The two men stared at each other, the tension palpable. Finally, Dobbs turned back to Willow. "Remember what I said, Miss Warren. Good day." With a final glare at Matthew, he departed, his footsteps echoing sharply down the hallway. When he was gone, Willow released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. That was tense. Man doesn't like being challenged, Matthew observed. I've met his type before. He all but threatened my position, Willow admitted, sinking into her chair. Matthew frowned. Because you wouldn't encourage his son's attentions, partly that, partly because of your intervention yesterday. She looked up at him. You shouldn't have made an enemy of Gerald Dobbs, Mr. Atwood. He wasn't exaggerating his influence in this town. I've faced worse, Matthew said simply. Then, changing the subject, I came to retrieve my coat and to check that you were all right. Oh, Willow stood quickly. Your coat. I'm afraid it's at my home. I washed it as best I could. No rush, he assured her. And my second question. I'm fine, she said automatically, then amended. Well, embarrassed and apparently on Gerald Dobbs's list of problems to solve, but otherwise unharmed. Matthew nodded thoughtfully. I didn't mean to complicate things for you. You didn't, Willow said firmly. Clancy Dobbs did that all on his own. A smile touched Matthew's lips. You're quite direct for a schoolteacher, Miss Warren. And you're quite chivalrous for a cowboy, Mr. Atwood. The words slipped out before she could stop them, and she felt her cheeks warm. His smile widened. I've been called many things, but chivalrous is a new one. He settled his hat back on his head. May I walk you home, Miss Warren? To collect my coat, of course. Willow knew she should refuse. A single woman walking with an unmarried man would certainly fuel more gossip, especially after yesterday's incident. But something about Matthew Atwood made her want to break her own careful rules. I would appreciate the company, she found herself saying. Just let me gather my things. As they walked through town together, Willow was acutely aware of the stares and whispers following them. Matthew seemed either oblivious or unconcerned. How long have you been teaching in San Pedro? He asked as they walked. Just over a year, Willow replied. I came from Boston after my parents passed. That's quite a journey to make alone, Willow nodded. It was time for a fresh start, and teaching positions for women are more plentiful out west. She glanced at him curiously. What brings you to California? You don't sound like you're from these parts. Originally from Montana Territory, Matthew confirmed. Been working cattle drives down to Texas, then took on a job bringing a herd west for a buyer here in San Pedro. And after that, Willow asked, surprised at her own boldness. Matthew shrugged. Hadn't thought that far ahead, though I'm starting to think San Pedro might be worth exploring a bit more thoroughly. The way he looked at her made it clear he wasn't talking about the town itself. They reached Willow's home, and she hesitated at the gate. Propriety dictated that she should retrieve his coat and bid him goodbye at the door, but instead she heard herself say, Would you like some coffee, Mr. Atwood? His eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled. I'd be obliged, Miss Warren. Inside her small but tidy home, Willow busied herself with the coffee pot, suddenly nervous. What was she thinking? Inviting a man she barely knew into her home. It wasn't proper, and if the school board heard about it, nice place you've got here, Matthew commented, respectfully remaining near the door, hat in hand. Reminds me of my aunt's house back in Helena. It's modest, but it suits me, Willow replied, grateful for his attempt to put her at ease. She gestured to a chair at her small table. Please, sit down. The coffee will be ready shortly. As she prepared the coffee, Willow stole glances at Matthew. In the light of her kitchen, she could see details she'd missed before: a thin scar along his jawline, the way his dark hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck, the crow's feet that spoke of years squinting against the sun. Your coat is hanging by the door, she said to break the silence. I hope I got most of the mud out. Thank you, he said, but made no move to retrieve it. Been meaning to ask, what do you teach, Miss Warren? Everything, she laughed. Reading, writing, arithmetic, history, geography. It's a small school, just one room for all ages. Sounds challenging. It is, but rewarding too. She placed a cup of coffee before him. The children here are eager to learn for the most part. Many of them will have opportunities their parents never did. Matthew sipped his coffee appreciatively. You care about them. Of course, Willow said, joining him at the table. Education is the key to a better future. It's what my parents believed and what I believe. And is teaching your future here in San Pedro? He asked. Despite men like Dobbs, Willow considered the question. I don't know any more. I love teaching, but if Mr. Dobbs convinces the school board not to renew my contract, what would you do then? Move on, I suppose. Find another town in need of a teacher. She sighed. It wouldn't be the first time I've had to start over. Matthew studied her thoughtfully. You're a brave woman, Miss Warren. Willow blinked in surprise. Brave? I don't think anyone's ever described me that way before. Traveling alone across the country, building a new life, standing up to men like Clancy Dobbs takes courage, Matthew said simply. His words warmed her more than the coffee. Thank you, Mr. Atwood, though I could say the same about a man who confronts the town's most powerful family on his first day in town. Matthew laughed, a rich sound that filled the small kitchen. That wasn't bravery, Miss Warren. That was just good manners and maybe a touch of poor judgment. They talked until the coffee grew cold, discovering shared interests in books and music. Matthew had been educated beyond what most would expect of a cowboy, having attended school in Helena until he was 16. Willow found herself relaxing in his company, laughing more than she had in months. When the light began to fade, Matthew finally stood. I should go. Thank you for the coffee and the conversation, Miss Warren. Willow, she said impulsively. My friends call me Willow. He smiled. Willow, he repeated, as if testing how it felt on his tongue. And I'm Matthew to my friends. At the door, he took his coat from the hook, draping it over his arm. Might I call on you again, Willow? The proper answer would be no. She had her reputation to consider, her position in the community. But looking up into his blue eyes, Willow found she didn't want to be proper. I would like that, Matthew. He tipped his hat with a smile and stepped out into the gathering dusk. Willow watched him walk away, a strange mixture of excitement and apprehension swirling within her. She had no illusions getting involved with Matthew Atwood, however innocently, would only deepen her troubles with the Dobbs family. And yet, as she closed her door, she couldn't bring herself to regret the invitation she'd extended. For the first time since arriving in San Pedro, Willow felt as though she'd found someone who saw her not as the proper Boston schoolteacher, not as a potential wife to be courted, but as herself. It was a dangerous feeling, but one she wasn't ready to relinquish just yet. The next few days passed in a blur of routine for Willow. She taught her classes, graded papers, and tried to ignore the increased whispering that seemed to follow her wherever she went. The incident with Clancy had already been the talk of the town, but her subsequent walk home with Matthew had added fuel to the gossip fire. To her surprise, Matthew kept his word and called on her again, first bringing her a book he thought she might enjoy, then offering to fix a loose shutter on her home. Each visit was conducted with perfect propriety, usually in the afternoon when neighbors could clearly see that nothing untoward was happening. Yet despite this caution, Willow could feel the town's opinion shifting against her. Mrs. Peterson, usually so friendly, now offered only curt nods. Parents who normally stayed to chat after school now hurried their children away. And Clancy Dobbs had taken to lounging across the street from the schoolhouse, watching her with a calculating expression that made her skin crawl. On Friday afternoon, a week after the boardwalk incident, Willow was surprised to find her classroom visited by Reverend Thomas after the children had left. "Miss Warren," the minister greeted her, his expression grave. "I wonder if I might have a word." "Of course, Reverend," she replied, setting aside the essays she'd been grading. "Is something wrong?" The minister cleared his throat uncomfortably. "It has come to my attention and that of several prominent members of the congregation that you have been entertaining a gentleman caller." "A Mr. Atwood, I believe." Willow felt her cheeks flush. "Mr. Atwood has called on me, yes. Always in the afternoon, always with the utmost propriety." "I'm sure," Reverend Thomas said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "However, as a teacher in this community, you must understand that you are held to a higher standard than most. Your behavior sets an example for the children." "And what behavior would that be, Reverend?" Willow asked, her voice tight. "Accepting the assistance of a gentleman when I was pushed into the mud. Offering him coffee as thanks." The minister's expression hardened slightly. "There is talk, Miss Warren. Talk that you have rejected the attentions of a respectable local man in favor of a drifter with no ties to our community." "By respectable local man, I assume you mean Clancy Dobbs, the man who pushed me off the boardwalk." Willow couldn't keep the bitterness from her voice. "Young Dobbs may have acted impulsively, but his family has been the backbone of this community for 20 years, the Reverend replied. "The school board meets next week to discuss your contract, and several members have expressed concerns about your judgment." The threat was clear. Willow took a deep breath, struggling to maintain her composure. "Am I to understand that my employment is contingent upon my personal relationships meeting with the approval of the Dobbs family?" "I wouldn't put it so bluntly," Reverend Thomas said, looking uncomfortable. "But as a woman alone, you must be mindful of appearances. Perhaps it would be wise to reconsider Clancy's invitation to the Founders' Day dance tomorrow night. It would go a long way toward smoothing things over." Willow stood, her hands trembling slightly with anger. "Thank you for your concern, Reverend. I'll give it all due consideration." Recognizing the dismissal, the minister nodded stiffly. "I hope you make the right choice, Miss Warren. Good day." After he left, Willow sank back into her chair, fighting back tears of frustration. This was exactly why she'd been so careful since arriving in San Pedro, maintaining a spotless reputation, keeping to herself, avoiding entanglements. One moment of vulnerability, one man's act of kindness, and suddenly her livelihood was threatened. She was still sitting there when a knock came at the classroom door. Looking up, she saw Matthew standing in the doorway, concern etched on his features. "Bad time?" he asked quietly. "No," Willow sighed, gesturing for him to enter. "Just the usual reminder that a woman's position in society is precarious at best." Matthew stepped inside, his expression somber. The Reverend left looking mighty pleased with himself. "I take it he was here about me." "About us," Willow confirmed. "Apparently my association with you is causing concerns among the school board." Matthew's jaw tightened. "I'm sorry, I never meant to cause trouble for you." "It's not your fault," Willow said, standing to gather her things. "It's this town. The Dobbs family owns everything and everyone, and heaven help anyone who doesn't fall in line." "What will you do?" Matthew asked. Willow laughed bitterly. "According to the Reverend, I should accept Clancy's invitation to the Founders' Day dance tomorrow and smooth things over." Matthew's expression darkened. "After what he did to you, that's..." He cut himself off, visibly restraining his anger. "What do you want to do?" The question caught Willow off guard. No one had asked what she wanted in a very long time. "I want..." she began, then faltered. "I need this position, Matthew. Teaching is all I have." He nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Then maybe it's best if I don't call on you anymore." The thought made her heart sink, but Willow knew he was right. Perhaps that would be wise. They stood in silence for a moment, the distance between them seeming to grow with each passing second. "I should go," Matthew said finally. "I just wanted to tell you that I'll be leaving San Pedro soon. My business here is almost concluded." "Oh," Willow tried to hide her disappointment. "When will you go?" "After the cattle sale on Monday," he said. "Heading back north after that." Another silence fell between them, heavy with unspoken words. "Well," Willow said, forcing brightness into her voice, "I wish you safe travels, Mr. Atwood." "Thank you, Miss Warren," he replied formally, his eyes never leaving hers. "It's been a pleasure knowing you." He turned to leave, and Willow felt as though something precious was slipping through her fingers. "Matthew," she called after him. He paused in the doorway, looking back. "The Founders' Day dance," she said impulsively. "Would you I don't suppose" a slow smile spread across his face. "Are you asking me to escort you to the dance, Miss Warren?" "Yes," Willow said, her heart racing. "Yes, I believe I am." "What about your position, the school board?" Willow straightened her shoulders. "If my employment depends on accepting the advances of a man who pushed me into the mud, perhaps I need to reconsider my options." Matthew's smile widened. "Then I would be honored to escort you, Willow." As he left, Willow wondered if she'd just made the biggest mistake of her life or the best decision she'd ever made. Either way, she knew that tomorrow night would change everything. The following evening, Willow stood before her small mirror, nervously adjusting the simple ivory dress she'd chosen for the dance. It wasn't fancy by San Pedro standards, certainly not compared to what the Dobbs ladies would wear, but it was her best, with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs. She'd arranged her hair in a more elaborate style than usual, pinning it up with her mother's pearl hairpins, her one extravagance, saved for special occasions. Looking at her reflection, Willow hardly recognized the woman staring back at her. Gone was the prim schoolteacher. In her place stood someone with flushed cheeks and bright eyes, anticipation lending a glow to her features. A knock at the door sent her heart racing. Taking a deep breath, she went to answer it, her stomach fluttering with nerves. Matthew stood on her porch, hat in hand, looking more polished than she'd ever seen him. He'd traded his usual trail clothes for a dark suit that, while not new, was well tailored to his broad shoulders. His dark hair was neatly combed, and he'd clearly visited the barber for a fresh shave. "Miss Warren," he said, his eyes warming as they took her in. "You look beautiful." "Thank you," she replied, suddenly shy. "You clean up rather well yourself, Mr. Atwood." He offered his arm with a smile. "Shall we?" As they walked toward the town hall where the dance was being held, Willow could feel the eyes of the town upon them. Neighbors peered from windows, and passers-by offered stilted greetings or none at all. By attending the Founders' Day dance with Matthew, she was making a statement, one that would be impossible for the Dobbs family to ignore. The town hall was decorated with bunting and lanterns, the large room transformed for the annual celebration of San Pedro's founding. A small band played in the corner, and tables laden with food and punch lined one wall. Nearly everyone in town was there, dressed in their finest attire. Their entrance caused a noticeable lull in the conversation, heads turning to stare as Matthew escorted Willow into the hall. She spotted Clancy Dobbs immediately, standing with his parents near the punch table, his face darkening when he saw them. "Perhaps this wasn't such a good idea," Willow murmured, her confidence wavering. "We can leave if you want," Matthew said quietly. "But I'd hate for you to miss the dance because of them." Willow straightened her spine. "No, you're right. I have as much right to be here as anyone." He smiled down at her. "That's the spirit." The music started up again, and Matthew extended his hand. "May I have this dance, Miss Warren?" Taking his hand, Willow allowed him to lead her onto the dance floor. Despite his rugged appearance, Matthew proved to be an excellent dancer, guiding her smoothly through the waltz. As they moved together, Willow gradually became less aware of the stares and whispers, focusing instead on the warmth of his hand at her waist, the surprising grace of his movements. "Where did a cowboy learn to dance like this?" she asked, genuinely curious. Matthew chuckled. "My mother insisted. Said no son of hers would embarrass himself at social gatherings, no matter how far from civilization he roamed." "She taught you well," Willow said, enjoying the ease with which they moved together. "She'd like you," he replied, his eyes softening. "Strong-willed, intelligent women always got along with my mother." The comment warmed Willow more than it should have. "And where is your mother now?" "Passed on 5 years ago," Matthew said. "My father followed a year later." "I'm sorry," Willow said, understanding the pain of such loss all too well. "They had a good life together," Matthew said simply. 40 years of it, that's more than most get." The dance ended, and Matthew escorted Willow to the refreshment table for punch. They'd just been served when Gerald Dobbs approached, his wife and son in tow. "Miss Warren," Dobbs said coldly, "I see you decided to attend after all, though not with the escort we discussed." "Mr. Dobbs," Willow acknowledged with a nod. "Mrs. Dobbs, Clancy." Clancy sneered at Matthew. "Still hanging around, cowboy. Thought you'd have moved on by now." "Not just yet," Matthew replied evenly. "San Pedro has its charms." "Indeed," Gerald said, his gaze flicking between Matthew and Willow. "Though I understand you'll be leaving soon. After the cattle sale on Monday, was it?" Willow stiffened at the implication that Dobbs had been keeping tabs on Matthew's business. "That's right," Matthew confirmed, seemingly unfazed. "Unless I find a compelling reason to stay." The way he glanced at Willow made her cheeks flush, and Mrs. Dobbs made a small sound of disapproval. "Miss Warren," Mrs. Dobbs said, speaking for the first time, "might I have a word in private?" Before Willow could respond, the older woman had taken her arm, steering her away from the men toward a quiet corner. Once they were out of earshot, Mrs. Dobbs turned to her, expression stern but not unkind. "My dear, you are making a grave mistake," she said bluntly. "This dalliance with the cowboy may seem romantic now, but consider your future, your position, your reputation." "Mrs. Dobbs, I appreciate your concern, but no, you listen to me," the older woman interrupted. "I've lived in San Pedro for 30 years. I know how quickly a woman's reputation can be destroyed. You're playing a dangerous game, rejecting my son's attentions for a man who will be gone by Tuesday." Willow bristled. "With all due respect, Mrs. Dobbs, your son pushed me off a boardwalk into the mud because I declined his invitation. That's not the behavior of a gentleman I'd wish to encourage." "Clancy can be impetuous," Mrs. Dobbs admitted. "But he comes from good family, has prospects, stability. What does your cowboy offer besides momentary excitement?" The question struck Willow harder than she expected, partly because she'd asked herself the same thing. What was she doing? Matthew would be gone in a few days, while she would have to live with the consequences of tonight's choices. "I should get back to my escort," Willow said, unwilling to continue the conversation. Mrs. Dobbs sighed. "Think about what I've said, dear. It's not too late to salvage your position here." Across the room, Willow could see that Matthew and the Dobbs men appeared to be having an equally tense conversation. Matthew's posture was relaxed, but she recognized the set of his jaw. He was angry, though controlling it carefully. As she approached, she heard Clancy saying, "Should know your place, cowboy. San Pedro isn't for your kind." "And what kind would that be?" Matthew asked mildly. "Drifters. Men with no roots, no responsibilities," Gerald Dobbs answered for his son. Men who charm innocent women and leave them to face the consequences alone. Matthew's eyes hardened. You don't know the first thing about me, Mr. Dobbs. I know your type, the older man retorted, and I know what's best for this town and the people in it. Willow reached Matthew's side, touching his arm lightly. I believe the next dance is starting, she said, hoping to diffuse the tension. Matthew looked down at her, his expression softening immediately. So it is. As he led her back to the dance floor, Willow could feel the Dobbs family's collective glare boring into her back. This time, the music was livelier, a reel that required concentration and left little room for conversation. Willow threw herself into it, determined to enjoy the evening despite the confrontation. They danced several more numbers, gradually relaxing as the night wore on. Other couples even began to engage them in conversation between dances, those citizens of San Pedro, not directly dependent on the Dobbs family's good graces. Willow began to hope that perhaps the evening would end without further incident. It was nearing 10 o'clock when Matthew suggested they step outside for some air. The night was pleasantly cool after the heat of the crowded hall, and they walked a short distance to a bench beneath one of the large oak trees that lined the town square. You're quite popular with your students, Matthew observed as they sat. That young girl, Lucy, could hardly contain her excitement at seeing her teacher at the dance. Willow smiled, thinking of her enthusiastic pupil. Lucy's a dear. Brightest student in my class, though she struggles with numbers. You care about them all, don't you? Not just the bright ones. Every child deserves an education, Willow said firmly, and every child has something to offer if you take the time to look. Matthew studied her in the moonlight. You're a remarkable woman, Willow Warren. His words sent a pleasant shiver through her. I'm just a school teacher, Matthew. No, he said softly. You're much more than that. The way he was looking at her made Willow's breath catch. For a moment she thought he might kiss her, and more surprising still, she realized she wanted him to. Instead, Matthew cleared his throat and glanced back toward the hall. We should probably return before your reputation suffers further damage. The reminder of her precarious position dampened Willow's spirits, but she nodded. You're right. As they stood to leave, Matthew hesitated. Willow, about what Dobbs said earlier about me leaving. It's all right, she said quickly. I've always understood that you'd be moving on. What if I wasn't? He asked unexpectedly. Willow stared at him. What do you mean? I've been thinking about settling down, Matthew said, his voice measured. Finding a place to put down roots. Willow's heart began to race. Here in San Pedro. It has its appeal, he said, his eyes never leaving hers. Though I'd need a good reason to stay. The implication hung between them, unspoken but clear. Before Willow could formulate a response, the sound of approaching footsteps interrupted them. Turning, she saw Clancy Dobbs walking toward them, his gait unsteady, a bottle dangling from his hand. Well, Clancy slurred, coming to a stop a few feet away. The schoolmarm and her pet Cowboy sneaking off in the dark. What would the school board say about that, I wonder? Matthew stepped slightly in front of Willow. You've had too much to drink, Dobbs. Go back inside. Clancy laughed, a harsh sound with no humor in it. Protecting her virtue. Bit late for that, isn't it? That's enough, Matthew said, his voice dangerously quiet. Apologize to the lady. Clancy spat. She's nothing but a... He never finished the sentence. Matthew moved so quickly that Willow barely saw it. One moment Clancy was standing there, the next he was sprawled on the ground, Matthew standing over him with fists clenched. Get up, Matthew said flatly. And choose your next words very carefully. Clancy struggled to his feet, his face contorted with rage. You'll regret that, Cowboy, he snarled, reaching inside his jacket. Willow's warning cry came too late. The moonlight glinted off metal as Clancy pulled a small pistol from his coat. Matthew tensed but didn't back down. "Put that away before you hurt yourself, Dobbs." "You think I won't use it?" Clancy's hand was shaking, whether from drink or anger Willow couldn't tell. "You've been a thorn in my side since you rode into town." "Mr. Dobbs, please," Willow pleaded, stepping forward despite Matthew's attempt to keep her behind him. "This is madness. Put the gun down." "Stay out of this," Clancy snapped, but his eyes flickered to her, his aim wavering. It was all the opening Matthew needed. In one fluid movement, he closed the distance between them, knocking the gun upward as it discharged into the night sky. The sound of the shot echoed across the square, and shouts came from the direction of the town hall as people began to pour outside to investigate. Matthew wrestled Clancy to the ground, disarming him with practiced ease. By the time Gerald Dobbs pushed through the gathering crowd, his son was pinned beneath Matthew's knee, the pistol safely in Matthew's possession. "What is the meaning of this?" Gerald demanded, taking in the scene with furious eyes. "Your son pulled a gun on us," Matthew said calmly, rising to his feet but keeping a wary eye on Clancy. "Fortunately, no one was hurt. He attacked me," Clancy protested, scrambling to his feet. "I was defending myself." "That's a lie," Willow said firmly, stepping forward. "Clancy approached us with a bottle in hand, clearly intoxicated, and made inappropriate remarks. When Mr. Atwood objected, Clancy drew his weapon." Murmurs ran through the crowd. Sheriff Taylor pushed his way forward, looking grim. "Is that true, Miss Warren?" "You'd swear to it." "I would," Willow confirmed, meeting the sheriff's gaze steadily. "She's lying to protect him," Clancy shouted, pointing at Matthew. "Everyone knows they've been carrying on together." The accusation brought a fresh wave of whispers from the onlookers. Willow felt her cheeks burn with humiliation. "That's enough, son," Gerald said sharply, gripping Clancy's arm. He turned to the sheriff. "This is all a misunderstanding. My son has had too much to drink, that's all. I'll take him home now." Sheriff Taylor looked uncertain, glancing between Clancy and Matthew. "There was a shot fired, Mr. Dobbs. That's a serious matter." "An accidental discharge," Gerald said dismissively. "No harm done. I'll take full responsibility for my son's behavior." The sheriff hesitated, clearly reluctant to challenge the town's most powerful citizen. Finally, he nodded. "See that he stays home for the remainder of the weekend, Mr. Dobbs. And I'll be keeping that pistol," he added, taking the weapon from Matthew. As Gerald led his protesting son away, the crowd began to disperse, returning to the dance or heading home, eager to spread the news of the confrontation. Soon, only Matthew, Willow, and the sheriff remained in the square. "You all right, Miss Warren?" Sheriff Taylor asked, his weathered face concerned. "Yes, thank you, Sheriff," Willow replied, though her hands were still trembling from the encounter. The sheriff turned to Matthew. "You handled yourself well, Atwood. Not many men could have disarmed a drunk without bloodshed." "Not my first encounter with a man who can't hold his liquor," Matthew said with a shrug. Sheriff Taylor nodded thoughtfully. "Well, I suggest you both head home. It's been excitement enough for one night." With a tip of his hat, he departed, leaving Willow and Matthew alone in the moonlit square. "I should take you home," Matthew said quietly. The walk back to Willow's house was silent, both of them processing what had happened. At her door, Willow turned to face him. "I'm sorry about tonight," she said. "I never meant to put you in danger." Matthew's expression softened. "You didn't." Clancy Dobbs made his own choices. "Still, if I hadn't asked you to the dance—" "I'm glad you did," Matthew interrupted. "Despite everything, this has been one of the best evenings I've had in a long time." Willow couldn't help but smile at that. "Even with a gun being pulled on you. Adds a certain excitement, don't you think?" His attempt at humor fell flat as he saw the worry in her eyes. "Willow, what's wrong?" "Everything," she admitted. After tonight, I don't think there's any saving my position at the school. The Dobbs family won't rest until I'm gone and the things Clancy said about us." She trailed off, unable to repeat the insinuations. "We could set the record straight," Matthew suggested. "I could speak to the school board, explain what happened." Willow shook her head. "It wouldn't matter. In their eyes, I've chosen sides against the most influential family in town. My reputation is already compromised." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the situation pressing down on them. "What will you do?" Matthew finally asked. Willow sighed. "What I've always done. Move on, find another town, another school that needs a teacher." "And if there was another option?" Matthew's voice was hesitant, unlike his usual confidence. "What other option could there be?" Willow asked. Matthew took a deep breath. "Come with me." The words hung in the air between them, unexpected and transformative. Willow stared at him, certain she'd misheard. "What? Come with me when I leave," Matthew repeated, more firmly this time. "I meant what I said earlier about settling down. I've been thinking about it for a while now, buying land, raising horses instead of driving cattle, building something permanent." Willow stammered, overwhelmed by the suggestion. "We barely know each other." "I know enough," he said simply. "I know you're brave and kind. I know you stand up for what's right, even when it costs you. I know I've never met anyone like you, Willow Warren." Her heart was racing, equal parts exhilaration and fear. "Where would we go?" "North," he said. "I've had my eye on land in Oregon Territory. Beautiful country growing fast. They need teachers there too." The idea was simultaneously terrifying and tantalizing. To leave everything behind, to start anew with this man she'd known for barely a week. "I don't expect an answer tonight," Matthew said gently, seeing her confusion. "Just think about it. I'll be at the cattle auction on Monday morning. If you decide to come with me, meet me at the livery stable at noon." Before Willow could respond, he leaned down and pressed a soft kiss to her cheek. "Good night, Willow," he murmured, then turned and walked away into the darkness. Willow stood on her porch long after he'd gone, her mind whirling with possibilities. Go with him. Leave everything she'd built in San Pedro. Start again in an unfamiliar territory with a man she was only beginning to know. It was madness. And yet, as she finally went inside, closing the door on the eventful night, Willow couldn't deny the small spark of hope that had ignited within her at Matthew's words. For the first time since arriving in San Pedro, she allowed herself to imagine a different future, one not defined by the constraints of a small town's expectations, or the whims of men like Gerald Dobbs. Whether that future included Matthew Atwood remained to be seen, but the mere possibility of it kept Willow awake long into the night. Sunday dawned bright and clear, but Willow hardly noticed the beautiful weather as she moved through her house, mechanically completing her usual Sunday tasks. Her mind was still reeling from Matthew's proposal the night before. Come with me. 3 simple words that could change everything. She attended church as usual, though she arrived late and sat in the back, avoiding the curious stares and whispers that followed her entrance. Reverend Thomas's sermon on moral fortitude seemed particularly pointed, but Willow kept her expression neutral, refusing to give the gossips more fuel. After the service, she slipped out before anyone could corner her, hurrying home to the solitude of her small house. There she paced restlessly, weighing her options, making lists of pros and cons that did nothing to clarify her swirling emotions. A knock at her door in the late afternoon startled her. Half hoping, half fearing it might be Matthew, Willow smoothed her skirts and went to answer it. Instead of Matthew, she found Mrs. Peterson standing on her porch, looking uncomfortable. "Mrs. Peterson," Willow greeted her, surprised. "Is everything all right? May I come in, Miss Warren?" the older woman asked, glancing over her shoulder as if concerned about being seen. Puzzled, Willow stepped aside. Of course. Once inside, Mrs. Peterson wasted no time. I've just come from a meeting of the school board, she said bluntly. An emergency session called by Gerald Dobbs. Willow's stomach sank. I see. They've voted to terminate your contract, effective immediately, Mrs. Peterson continued, her expression sympathetic. Dobbs claimed you've shown moral turpitude unbefitting an educator of youth. Despite having anticipated this outcome, the news still stung. I see, Willow repeated, sinking into a chair. It's not right, Mrs. Peterson said firmly. Half the board knows it too, but none dared stand against Dobbs. My Albert tried, but he was outvoted. Willow managed a small smile of gratitude. Albert Peterson had always been kind to her. Thank you for telling me. Mrs. Peterson hesitated, then said, There's more. Dobbs has instructed Sheriff Taylor to investigate the incident at the dance last night. He's claiming that cowboy of yours assaulted Clancy without provocation. That's absurd, Willow exclaimed. Clancy pulled a gun on us. I believe you, Mrs. Peterson assured her, but with the Dobbs family's influence. She let the implication hang in the air. When will the sheriff want to speak with me? Willow asked, her mind racing. Tomorrow morning. I thought you should know before they came knocking. Mrs. Peterson reached out to pat Willow's hand. For what it's worth, child, I think you're better off leaving San Pedro. This town doesn't deserve you. After Mrs. Peterson left, Willow sat motionless, absorbing the news. She'd lost her position, her livelihood, her purpose. And now Matthew might be in legal trouble because of her. The decision that had seemed so difficult that morning suddenly crystallized with perfect clarity. There was nothing left for her in San Pedro. Nothing but humiliation and the vindictive pursuit of the Dobbs family. Moving with new purpose, Willow began to pack. She wouldn't wait until Monday. She needed to find Matthew tonight, warn him about the sheriff's investigation, and tell him that, yes, she would go with him. The sun was setting as Willow finished packing her most essential belongings into 2 small trunks. She couldn't take much, just clothes, a few books, her mother's jewelry, and personal mementos. The furniture and household items would have to be left behind. She was just latching the second trunk when another knock came at her door. This time the visitor was Sheriff Taylor himself. Evening, Miss Warren, he said, removing his hat as she opened the door. May I come in? Willow stepped aside wordlessly, her heart pounding. Had Mrs. Peterson been wrong about the timing? Or had Gerald Dobbs accelerated his plans? The sheriff's eyes fell on her packed trunks and his eyebrows rose. Going somewhere. I've been terminated from my position, Willow said evenly. There's no reason for me to stay in San Pedro. Sheriff Taylor nodded, unsurprised. I heard about the school board's decision. Came by to tell you that I've been asked to look into last night's incident. He glanced again at her trunks. But it seems you're already planning to leave town. Is that a problem? Willow asked carefully. The sheriff was silent for a moment, studying her. Finally, he sighed. Miss Warren, I've been sheriff in this town for 15 years. Seen a lot of people come and go. Some leave footprints, others don't leave a trace. He gestured to her trunks. Looks to me like you're planning to leave before sunrise. It wasn't a question, but Willow nodded anyway. I thought it would be best. And Atwood. He planning a hasty departure too? I don't know, Willow said truthfully. I haven't spoken to him since last night. Sheriff Taylor rubbed his chin thoughtfully. Gerald Dobbs is a powerful man in San Pedro, but he doesn't own the law. Not yet, anyway. He settled his hat back on his head. I'll be at the cattle auction tomorrow morning. Probably won't have time to start any investigations until the afternoon. Say around 2 o'clock. His pointed look made his meaning clear. Relief washed over Willow. I understand, Sheriff. Good, he said, turning to leave. Oh, and Miss Warren, for what it's worth, I think you were good for this town. Shame not everyone sees it that way. After the sheriff left, Willow moved quickly. She couldn't wait until morning now. She needed to find Matthew tonight. Donning her cloak, she slipped out of her house and made her way toward the center of town, where the modest hotel stood. The hotel clerk, a young man named Eddie who had a sister in Willow's class, looked up in surprise when she entered. "Miss Warren, can I help you?" "I'm looking for Mr. Atwood," Willow said, trying to appear calmer than she felt. "Is he staying here?" Eddie nodded. "Room 204. But he's not in at the moment. Said he was going to the livery to check on his horse." "Thank you," Willow said, already turning to leave. The livery stable was on the outskirts of town, a fair walk from the hotel. As Willow hurried through the darkening streets, she kept a wary eye out for any sign of the Dobbs family or their associates. The last thing she needed was another confrontation. The stable was quiet when she arrived, just a single lantern burning inside. Willow hesitated at the entrance, suddenly unsure. What if Matthew wasn't here? What if he'd already heard about the investigation and left town? "Hello," she called softly, stepping inside. "Matthew." A rustling sound came from one of the stalls, and a moment later Matthew emerged, surprise evident on his face. "Willow, what are you doing here?" The sight of him sent a wave of relief through her. "I needed to find you. There's trouble." Quickly, she explained about the school board's decision and the sheriff's intended investigation. Matthew listened gravely, his expression darkening as she spoke. "So Dobbs is trying to run us both out of town," he said when she finished. "He succeeded with me," Willow admitted. "I've already packed." Matthew studied her in the dim lantern light. "And have you made a decision?" "About my offer?" Willow took a deep breath. "Yes. If it still stands, I'd like to go with you." The smile that broke across Matthew's face was like the sun emerging from clouds. "It still stands," he assured her, taking a step closer. "But are you sure? It won't be easy starting over again." "I'm sure," Willow said with newfound confidence. "There's nothing left for me here, and the truth is—" She hesitated, then plunged ahead. "The truth is, I want to see where this might lead. Us, I mean." Matthew's smile softened as he reached out to take her hand. "I was hoping you'd say that." For a moment they stood there, hands clasped, the future suddenly opening before them like an uncharted trail. "We should leave tonight," Matthew said, breaking the spell. "If Dobbs is determined enough, he might convince the sheriff to move up his investigation." "Sheriff Taylor came to see me," Willow told him. "He all but told me we should be gone by tomorrow afternoon." Matthew nodded. "Good man, Taylor. Always figured he was more decent than most." He glanced around the stable. "My horse is ready to ride. How much have you packed?" "2 trunks," Willow said. "Not much, just essentials." "We'll need a wagon," Matthew decided. "I know where we can get one tonight, no questions asked." He squeezed her hand. "Go back home and wait for me. I'll come for you within the hour." As Willow turned to leave, Matthew called after her. "Willow," she looked back. "Yes. I'm glad you're coming with me," he said simply. The hour that followed was the longest of Willow's life. She returned home and sat beside her packed trunks, alternating between excitement and terror at what she was about to do. Was she making another mistake? Or was this the beginning of something wonderful? The sound of a wagon approaching interrupted her thoughts. Looking out the window, she saw Matthew pulling up outside, driving a small but sturdy-looking wagon hitched to 2 horses. His own mount, a handsome buckskin, was tethered to the back. Willow didn't hesitate. Grabbing her cloak and reticule, she opened the door just as Matthew reached it. "Ready?" he asked, his eyes searching hers. "Yes," she said firmly. Together they loaded her trunks into the wagon. Willow took one last look at the small house that had been her home for the past year, then climbed up onto the wagon seat beside Matthew. "No regrets?" he asked quietly as he flicked the reins. "None," Willow replied, and was surprised to find she meant it. They left San Pedro under cover of darkness, taking the northern road out of town. Matthew drove steadily, keeping the horses at a brisk but sustainable pace. They would need to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the town before morning. As the lights of San Pedro faded behind them, Willow felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. Ahead lay uncertainty, a new territory, a new life, and the unknown potential of her relationship with the man beside her. Yet instead of fear, she felt a growing sense of freedom and possibility. "Matthew," she said, breaking the comfortable silence between them. He responded, glancing over at her. "Thank you, for helping me that day on the boardwalk, for everything since." His smile was visible even in the moonlight. "Best mud I ever stepped in," he said. And Willow found herself laughing, the sound carrying into the vast, open night that lay before them. They traveled through the night and well into the next day, stopping only briefly to rest the horses and take hurried meals. Matthew was familiar with the route north, having traveled it before, and knew places where they could stop without drawing undue attention. By the time the sun was high in the sky on Monday, when the sheriff would have been starting his investigation, they were already far from San Pedro, the coastal roads giving way to more rugged terrain as they moved inland, heading toward Oregon territory. That evening they made camp by a small stream, the first proper rest they'd allowed themselves since leaving town. As Matthew built a fire and prepared a simple meal from their provisions, Willow found herself watching him, still marveling at the turn her life had taken in just a week's time. "Penny for your thoughts," Matthew said, catching her gaze. "I was just thinking how strange life can be," Willow replied. "A week ago I was a respectable schoolteacher with a secure position. Now I'm a scandalous woman who's run off with a cowboy she barely knows." Matthew chuckled. "When you put it that way, it does sound rather dramatic." "It is dramatic," Willow said, but she was smiling. "Exactly the sort of thing I would have warned my female students against." "Regretting your decision?" Matthew asked, a hint of concern in his voice. Willow shook her head. "No. But I am wondering what happens next." Matthew set aside the coffee pot and came to sit beside her on the fallen log she'd chosen as a seat. "Next, we continue north. I know a place in southern Oregon, a small valley with good water and better grazing land, room to raise horses, build a house." He hesitated, then added, "room to build a life if that's what we want." The casual way he included her in his plans made Willow's heart skip. "And what do we tell people about us, I mean?" "The truth," Matthew said simply. "That we're starting fresh." "Together," Willow added, testing the word. "Together," he confirmed, his eyes meeting hers. "If that's still what you want." In answer, Willow leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. It was a brief kiss, tentative and sweet, but it carried a promise that made Matthew's eyes darken when she pulled away. "I'll take that as a yes," he said, his voice slightly rough. Willow smiled. "It's a yes." The journey north took nearly 2 weeks, a time of discovery for both of them. They talked for hours as the wagon rolled through changing landscapes about their childhoods, their dreams, the books they'd read, and the places they'd seen. They weathered a sudden rainstorm huddled together beneath a hastily erected canvas, and shared the wonder of a stunning sunset over a mountain range Willow had only read about in geography books. By the time they crossed into Oregon territory, Willow felt as though she'd known Matthew for years rather than weeks. The initial leap of faith she'd taken in leaving with him had evolved into a deep trust and growing affection that surprised her with its intensity. Matthew's small valley, turned out to be more impressive than his modest description had suggested, a lush expanse of green nestled between protective hills, with a clear stream running through its heart. A few scattered farms dotted the periphery, but the center of the valley remained unclaimed. "It's beautiful," Willow breathed as Matthew halted the wagon on a rise overlooking the land. "The town of Oak Ridge is about 5 miles that way," Matthew said, pointing east. "Small but growing. They've got a general store, a smithy, even a hotel of sorts." And he added with a meaningful look, "No school yet." Willow's eyes widened. "No school. The railroad's planning to extend a line through here next year," Matthew explained. "Folks are already starting to settle in anticipation. There's at least a dozen children in the area with no formal education." "You planned this," Willow accused, but there was no anger in her voice. Matthew shrugged, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Let's say I did my research before asking you to come with me. I wouldn't have brought you all this way if I didn't think you could find purpose here too." Touched by his thoughtfulness, Willow leaned against his shoulder. "So what now, Mr. Atwood?" "Now," he said, flicking the reins to start the horses moving again, "we find ourselves a piece of land, build a cabin before winter sets in, and see about starting that school you're already planning in your head." Willow laughed. "And what makes you think I'm planning a school already?" "Because I'm starting to know you, Willow Warren," Matthew replied, "and I've never met a more dedicated teacher. The first few months in Oregon were challenging but exhilarating." They purchased a promising tract of land in the valley, 40 acres with frontage on the stream, and Matthew immediately set about building a small but sturdy cabin with the help of neighbors eager to welcome newcomers to the area. Willow, meanwhile, quickly established herself in the growing community. When word spread that a trained teacher had arrived from California, parents began approaching her about lessons for their children. By the time the first snow fell, Willow was teaching 15 students in the front room of the Johnsons' farmhouse, a temporary arrangement until a proper schoolhouse could be built in the spring. Their cabin was completed just before the first heavy snowfall, a snug one-room structure with a stone fireplace and sturdy walls that kept out the winter chill. It was simple but comfortable, and as Willow hung curtains at the windows and arranged her books on the shelves Matthew had built, she felt a sense of ownership and belonging she'd never experienced in San Pedro. They had agreed to a somewhat unconventional arrangement. Matthew slept on a bedroll near the fire, giving Willow the single bed they'd managed to acquire. It was a compromise born of mutual respect and the practical reality that while they were committed to building a life together, they were still learning each other's ways. The winter months brought them closer, confined as they were to the small cabin during the worst of the weather. They developed routines and rhythms, discovered each other's strengths and weaknesses, argued occasionally, but always found their way back to harmony. By the time spring arrived, Willow knew she was in love with Matthew Atwood. She suspected he felt the same, though neither had spoken the words aloud. On a mild April evening, as they sat on the porch, Matthew had added to the cabin, watching the sunset paint the valley in shades of gold and pink. Willow finally asked the question that had been on her mind. "Why did you really ask me to come with you that night in San Pedro?" Matthew was silent for a moment, his eyes on the distant hills. "The honest truth, of course. Because from the moment I saw you struggling to stand in that mud, trying to maintain your dignity despite everything, I knew you were different," he said simply. "Strong in a way that had nothing to do with physical strength, brave in a way that mattered." He turned to look at her, his expression earnest. "I didn't plan to stay in San Pedro, didn't plan to get involved. But then there you were, and suddenly all my plans seemed less important than getting to know the woman who taught school by day and read Shakespeare by lamplight. Willow blinked in surprise. "How did you know I read Shakespeare?" Matthew's smile was sheepish. "I may have watched your house a time or two in the evenings, saw you through the window, reading by the lamp." "That's either romantic or concerning," Willow laughed. "A bit of both, probably," Matthew admitted. "But the point is, I recognized something in you that I'd been looking for without realizing it. And when I saw how that town was treating you, how they were trying to force you into a mold you didn't fit." He shook his head. "I couldn't leave you there." "So you rescued me," Willow said softly. "No," Matthew corrected her. "You rescued yourself. I just provided transportation." Willow laughed at that, but she knew what he meant. The decision to leave had been hers, born of her own courage and determination. "I'm glad I came with you," she said, reaching for his hand. "These past months have been extraordinary." Matthew interlaced his fingers with hers. "Willow, there's something I've been meaning to ask you." Her heart began to race at the serious note in his voice. "Yes. We've been living in this cabin for months now. Built a life here together. But there's something missing, something I want to make right." He turned to fully face her, still holding her hand. "I love you, Willow Warren. I think I have since that first day in San Pedro. And if you'll have me, I'd like to make this arrangement of ours permanent. Properly permanent." Willow's breath caught. "Matthew Atwood, are you proposing to me?" "Inelegantly, but yes," he confirmed, a smile touching his lips. "Will you marry me, Willow? Be my wife, my partner in whatever comes next." Tears pricked at Willow's eyes as joy welled within her. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you." Matthew's smile was brilliant as he pulled her into his arms, sealing their engagement with a kiss that held all the promise of their future together. They were married in late May, in the newly completed schoolhouse that the community had built for Willow. The entire settlement turned out for the occasion: farmers and ranchers, shopkeepers from Oak Ridge, even the circuit preacher who had delayed his departure for 2 days to perform the ceremony. Willow wore a new dress of pale blue silk that Matthew had ordered all the way from Portland as a surprise, and carried wildflowers picked from their own land. Matthew, clean-shaven and solemn in a new suit, watched her walk toward him with such undisguised love that several of the women in attendance dabbed at their eyes. "Never seen a man look at a woman quite like that," Mrs. Johnson whispered to her husband. "Like she's the answer to every question he ever had." Their vows were simple but heartfelt, each promising to stand by the other through whatever life might bring. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, the cheer that went up nearly raised the roof of the new schoolhouse. The celebration continued well into the evening, with food and music and dancing in the lamplight. As Willow and Matthew moved together in their first dance as husband and wife, she couldn't help but think of that other dance in San Pedro that had changed the course of their lives. "What are you smiling about, Mrs. Atwood?" Matthew asked, noting her expression. The name sent a thrill through her. "Mrs. Atwood," she repeated. "I'm still getting used to that." "You have a lifetime to practice," Matthew assured her, pulling her closer as they danced. "I was thinking about that night in San Pedro," Willow admitted. "The Founder's Day dance. How differently things might have turned out if you hadn't helped me up from that mud." "I'm glad I was there," Matthew said simply. "So am I," Willow replied, resting her head against his chest as they swayed to the music. "So am I." Later that night, as they returned to their cabin, now truly their home in every sense, Willow felt a sense of completion she'd never known before. The journey from that muddy street in San Pedro to this moment had been unexpected and sometimes difficult, but she wouldn't have changed a single step. In the years that followed, the small settlement grew into a proper town, spurred by the arrival of the railroad as predicted. The school expanded, eventually requiring Willow to hire an assistant teacher to help with the growing number of students. Matthew's horse breeding business thrived as well. His eye for good stock and fair dealings earned him a reputation that spread throughout the territory, bringing buyers from as far away as San Francisco. They expanded their cabin into a comfortable farmhouse, adding rooms as their needs changed, first a proper kitchen and dining room, then a study for Willow's books, and finally, in their third year of marriage, a nursery. Their son, James, arrived on a stormy November night with Mrs. Johnson serving as midwife and Matthew pacing anxiously outside the bedroom door until the first cry announced the baby's arrival. "He has your eyes," Willow told Matthew as he held his son for the first time, awe and terror mingling in his expression. "And your determination," Matthew replied, watching as the tiny hand gripped his finger with surprising strength. "Poor child, with the two of us as parents, he'll be the most stubborn person in Oregon territory." Willow laughed, exhausted but radiantly happy. "I wouldn't have it any other way." 2 years later, their daughter Elizabeth joined the family, followed by another son, William, 3 years after that. Their home rang with children's laughter, occasional tears, and the constant bustle of a growing family. Through it all, Matthew and Willow remained partners in every sense, supporting each other's ambitions, sharing responsibilities, and never forgetting the unlikely circumstances that had brought them together. On their 10th anniversary, Matthew surprised Willow with a trip back to California, not to San Pedro, but to San Francisco, where they spent a week exploring the vibrant city, attending the theater, and enjoying the luxury of time alone together. On their last night there, as they walked along the waterfront watching ships come and go in the busy harbor, Matthew asked, "Do you ever regret it? Leaving your teaching position, coming with me?" Willow looked up at him, this man who had become the center of her world. "Never," she said with absolute certainty. "Everything I've built since then, our home, our family, the school in Oak Ridge, it's all been more fulfilling than I could have imagined." Matthew smiled, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "Even when I track mud into the house after working with the horses, or when I snore loud enough to wake the children. Even then," Willow laughed, leaning into his embrace, "though I do wish you'd learn to use the boot scraper I placed by the door specifically for that purpose." "I'll work on it for the next 10 years, he promised solemnly. "See that you do, Mr. Atwood," she replied with mock severity. "I expect improvements by our 20th anniversary." As they returned to their hotel, Willow reflected on how far they'd come from that fateful day when she'd found herself face down in the mud of San Pedro. What had seemed like humiliation had actually been the beginning of everything good in her life: her marriage, her children, the school she'd built, the community that had embraced them. Sometimes the worst moments led to the best destinations, she thought. And sometimes the right person appearing at exactly the right time could change everything. In the autumn of their 30th year in Oregon, Willow and Matthew sat on the porch of their farmhouse, watching their grandchildren play in the yard. Their eldest son, James, had taken over much of the horse breeding business, allowing Matthew to slow down a bit, though he still insisted on working with the special cases, the horses that needed extra patience and understanding. Willow had retired from teaching a few years earlier, handing over the now substantial school to a capable young woman who reminded her a bit of herself at that age. She still volunteered occasionally and served on the school board, unwilling to completely sever her connection to education. "Do you remember when we first saw this valley?" Matthew asked, his hair now silver but his blue eyes as bright as ever. "How empty it was." "I remember," Willow said, looking out at the prosperous town that had grown up around them. Oak Ridge now boasted several streets of businesses, a town hall, 3 churches, and even a small hotel. Their own property remained a peaceful haven on the outskirts, though their children's homes were within easy visiting distance. Did you ever imagine it would become all this? Matthew gestured toward the town. Not specifically, Willow admitted, but I knew it would be something special. I could feel it that first day. Matthew took her hand, the gesture as natural after all these years as breathing. You know what tomorrow is, Willow smiled. Of course. 35 years since a muddy boardwalk in San Pedro. Best mud I ever stepped in, Matthew said, repeating what had become a private joke between them over the decades. Indeed, Willow agreed, squeezing his hand, though I could have done without the public humiliation part. Ah, but then I wouldn't have had the chance to play the gallant hero, Matthew teased. You've had plenty of other chances since then, Willow pointed out. Like when that bull nearly trampled me in our second year here, or when I fell through the ice on the stream that winter. Those were just maintenance heroics, Matthew said dismissively. To keep in practice. The boardwalk was the original and best. Willow laughed, the sound as delighted as it had been when she was younger. At 60, her hair had silvered elegantly, and fine lines marked the corners of her eyes and mouth lines earned through years of laughter and occasional tears. To Matthew, she was more beautiful now than the day he'd helped her from the mud. What shall we do to celebrate tomorrow? She asked. 35 years is quite a milestone. Matthew pretended to consider the question. We could push each other into mud for old time's sake. Absolutely not, Willow said firmly. These old bones don't recover from falls the way they used to. Then perhaps a quiet dinner, just the two of us, Matthew suggested. James and Mary offered to take the grandchildren for the night. That sounds perfect, Willow agreed. As twilight deepened into evening, they remained on the porch, watching stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. The sound of their grandchildren's laughter mingled with the familiar night sounds of the valley crickets chirping, a distant owl, the soft nickering of horses in the paddock. You think they'll tell our story someday? Willow asked softly. Our children, our grandchildren. What the tale of the schoolteacher and the cowboy, Matthew smiled. I imagine they will. It's got all the elements of a good story, villains, heroes, a dramatic escape. And a happy ending, Willow added. Matthew leaned over to press a kiss to her temple. The happiest, he agreed. Though I don't think it's an ending at all, more like a middle that keeps going. A middle that keeps going, Willow repeated thoughtfully. I like that. As the first stars of evening twinkled overhead, Willow Warren Atwood leaned against her husband's shoulder, content in the knowledge that their story begun in mud and adversity had blossomed into something rare and precious. A love that had withstood the test of time, a partnership that had weathered all seasons, and a family that would carry their legacy forward. Not bad, she thought, for a woman who once found herself face down in the mud of San Pedro with a ruined dress and wounded pride. Not bad at all.